Australia is not a country for novels. It is more properly a country for short stories. There are, of course, Australian novelists, and there are some good ones, but not great ones. There are no Australian novels indispensable to the Western canon. Perhaps Patrick White is the exception, the fullest account of the novel in an Australian setting. Although even then, White had to relocate to England to write the great Australian novel. The Chinese word for novel means long-length small talk, and in general Australians, reticent and sardonic, are only given to short-length small talk, the story, the yarn. The Australian continent is epic, but Australian life is not. It is dwarfed by the land and its emptiness. There is rarely the critical mass of life that warrants a novel. That is, the novel as a literary form does not grow naturally out of the Australian experience, and so in a sense all novel writing in Aus-lit, like so much else, is imported and derivative. There is not much poetry in Australia either, for that matter. The most accomplished poet of world pretensions, Christopher Brennan, found his inspiration in the French symbolists whilst in Berlin, and once said that his poems could have been written in China. The fact that he was in Sydney was purely incidental. The irony of Australian poetry is that its most notable poet was fictitious and the subject of a hoax. The ghost of Ern Malley has haunted Australian poetry ever since. One of the instigators, Harold Stewart, fled to Kyoto. He could find no poetry in Australia. I went to Kyoto several times and followed the footsteps of Harold Stewart, and I see what he means. The irony for him is that arguably the poems of Ern Malley are the best poems he ever wrote. There is real poetry in Ern Malley, and the voice of Ern Malley still resounds awkwardly. Literary modernity had a difficult birth in Australia. There are good Australian poets, but again poetry does not arise naturally out of the Australian landscape. I suppose I'm influenced by my late colleague Clive Faust. He went to Kyoto to live and knew Harold Stewart. Faust refused to publish his poetry in Australia. Why cast pearls before swine? There is bugger all poetry in Australian accent and idiom in any case, but also no space for it in the Australian soul. You would say with Harold Stewart, the Japanese are a poetic people. You wouldn't accuse Australians of that. It's not an easy place to be a poet. The natural form is the short story, and so in poetry it is the rollicking ballad, the short story in verse. The greatest exponent of it was Banjo Paterson, noting though that, curiously, the banjo is an American instrument with no place in Australian folk culture. The appellation is already borrowed. The father of the Australian short story tradition is Henry Lawson. It is a tradition of short rural fiction. Another irony because Australia is one of the most urbanised countries in the world. Rural life seems authentic. The cities, as A.D. Hope said, are like teeming sores. The country, in fact, is a huge mine. Those cities are built on mining wealth and rural toil and are in that sense parasitic. Australia doesn't develop or refine its resources or turn those resources into beautiful things. We just dig it up and sell it and leave the niceties to more sophisticated people. There is of course an urban literature too, but like the cities themselves, it is largely Americanised. Everybody saw the Australian doing break dancing, so-called, at the Olympics recently. Well, frankly, a lot of recent Australian literature is like that, embarrassing imitations of American models. Even the graffiti in Australian cities is a wannabe imitation of American urban decay. What America and Australia have in common is suburbia, huge sprawling cities, a wasteland of mortgages, consumerism and car culture. The post-war Americanisation added the crass to the vulgar. The most significant writer to ever write in Australia was the visitor D.H. Lawrence, a natural-born novelist, if ever there was one. But we see how he struggled to extract a coherent novel from his experience of either the city or the bush. The best passages in his novel Kangaroo, a very strange work, are poetic and almost mystical vignettes of the bush, one of the few profound, non-sentimental pieces of writing about the Australian natural world. Australian writers have struggled to expand the repertoire. It is a wholesome but not distinguished colonial literature. Countless Australian writers and artists, let's mention, apart from Patrick White, Nick Cave, Barry Humphries, people in all creative fields, fled back to the English motherland in order to escape the limitations of Australia and to think bigger and deeper thoughts, and to find a level of seriousness that is not natural in Australia either. The short story tradition and the ballad tradition are essentially humorous. It is a redeeming feature that Australians don't take themselves very seriously, and there is a quirkiness that perhaps New Zealanders do better, but it is part of the Australian character all the same. There is some rugged realism in Australian short stories, capturing the brutality and violence of the country. It is a brutal and violent country. But this social realist literature tends to be journalistic and moralistic, and it overlooks the undercurrent of absurdity. It is a broad and sometimes surreal humour that you find in this short rural fiction. In one of his stories, Henry Lawson relates how tough sheep are. They are the toughest creatures in the world, he says, with the possible exception of crocodiles. And he describes how you can cut one open, drag out its innards, wave them around on a stick, put them back in and sew the sheep up again, and the jumbuck, he says, will stand up and start eating grass. That's how tough they are. That's a very Australian turn of mind. So too, Lawson's The Loaded Dog, probably, I think, the gold standard of Australian stories. If you don't know it, it's a story about a dog running amok, playing fetch with a stick of dynamite in its mouth. It has always been Anglo-Celtic, but the gold rushes brought a flood of people from all lands, especially the Chinese. And then there have been waves of immigration up to the present day. Conversely, Australians have started to frequent Southeast Asia, although mainly in the bars of Bali. Establishment progressives call it multiculturalism, but it's really a monoculture with some immigrants. It is a very homogeneous monoculture. It is extraordinary how little difference there is in Australian language, accent, vocabulary, intonation, habits, from one part of the continent to the other, uniform and unvarying. In England, people living 20 miles apart can have entirely different accents. Only about 10% of Australians have what is called the educated voice, a more cosmopolitan attempt at a non-accent, with most of the nasal drawls excised. For the most part, though, Australians like living in a cliché, and those that don't find the uniformity oppressive. Australia is always 10, 15, 20 years behind the rest of the world, the tyranny of distance, they say. And many writers and artists have wasted their efforts trying to bring it up to date. They might have done better finding the advantages of living in a backwater outside the mainstream and seeing the world as an outsider, blessed with a natural suspicion of bullshit, pomp and pretension. So if there is a novel in Australia, it is best to compress it into a short story. And if there is poetry too, it's best to put it into a short story. The short story tradition is worthy, and it is worth expanding, reiterating and extending. Linguistically, there are certain traits worth celebrating, exaggerating and making fun of. Because we're writing in the English language, and our first allegiance is always to the English language. And there is the ever-present task of trying to nurture its roots. Mainly in Australia, there is the tension between the vulgar colloquial and the faux sophistication of the would-be British establishment. Britain is 10,000 miles away, and upper-class English in Australia is a bit shoddy. It goes back to the First Fleet and European settlement. There were two types of Australians from the beginning, the convicts and the prison guards, and they came from different social classes and spoke different types of English. When it is being true, Australian writing revolves around that tension. Short Stories in the Mail, a subversive literary strategy, was a service that operated for many years. Hard copy booklets of short stories would arrive in the mail. It was a free service, but usually broke even on the basis of donations of cash or postage stamps. More recently, the service has been suspended because of rising postal costs. I can print the booklets for $1 each. The postage is 3 times that. It's a subscription service open to subscribers from throughout the world. American subscribers are good. Americans have a tipping culture. There are about 50 or so stories in circulation through Short Stories in the Mail. The idea was to never make them available in digital form. The idea was also to sidestep the ridiculous trundle of conventional publishing. You're a short story writer? Well, submit your stories to magazines and contests. Entry fee of $20, no feedback, and there is a closed circle of people pandering to the same political outlook who win all the time. I don't care to be involved in all of that. More recently, I've taken to presenting readings of selected stories, old and new, in a video format. We've reached the point where people need stories to be read to them. Some stories are occasional and very local. Some stories are written for public performance, such as at Australia's only short story festival, the Newstead Short Story Tattoo. Some are lost, and all I have left are the rubrics. There are about 200 stories in all. As an academic, I wrote articles, essays, books, the usual. My mentor, the late Roger Sauter, always told me my nonsense stories were much better than my academic work. A backhanded compliment. He was very encouraging. The first time he read one of my stories, he said, "You write like Damon Runyon, only better." If anything, I've sometimes tried to write like Ruskin Bond, the Indian story writer, whose stories I discovered when I was in Darjeeling, quite apart from my obvious debt to Lawson and the wider Australian short story tradition. There is a series of my stories written in India and Malaysia, the Australian in the post-colonial ruins of the British Empire. The short story, though, is the natural form of writing for me. I tell stories, usually funny ones, but it's also the format in which I choose to have serious subtext and in which I choose to embed some of my philosophical and academic musings these days. They are harmless and wildly overwritten. The restraints of academic prose were just too much. Seriously, academic prose is appalling. Sometimes, on rainy days, I would visit the Sandhurst collection, the remnants of a library from the 19th century, travel works, technical books on geology and so forth. They are beautifully written. The contemporary academic prose of my lifetime, let's single out sociology here and luminaries such as Derrida and Foucault and co., is unforgivably degenerate. I'd rather write short stories.